Okay, so I bring greetings on behalf of the Chairman and Board of Directors of React International and also congratulate the Council on this initiative. Now, training is important to React. So I say well done to the teams and the members of React, as well as prospectives for your efforts in keeping abreast of technology and relevant information to React. So now on to our agenda this evening. All right, so again, certainly a warm welcome to all. The agenda this evening will be as follows on your screen. We will be, of course, all things safety. So we just have a safety moment, safety first. Just a little theoretical construct called the communications model. We'll just look at what that is. Then we go into radio equipment categories and components. We will see what's the difference between simplex and repeater communications. We'll discuss radio frequency modes and bandwidth. Then we'll talk about radio equipment type certifications, and then the IP, what is called IP ratings, and we'll also talk about FM or factory mutual at the same time. Then we'll discuss licensing or license conditions, some compliance best practices, and of course some other available training. Right? So that's our broad agenda that the slides will reflect this evening, right? All right, so first of all, safety first, right? So we are radio operators, we are React members, some may be amateur radio operators, licensed and so on. But at the end of the day, we all use radio equipment in what we do. Even if we're using voice over IP applications such as a phone in our deployment, the point is that we are using radio of some kind, and a mobile phone, a tablet is in fact a mobile device. So we need to bear those things in mind. But our radio equipment that we use, that we'll be talking about quite a number of specifications or parameters as we discuss the radio technology. And that's what our mainstay is in React. Of course, that's the product that we use, that's the service that we deliver. It's about radio. So invariably, radio has its, while it's fantastic for communication, we are able to offer communication services as React. We're able to communicate with each other, and we are also able to facilitate emergencies, disasters, and all sorts of other means of communication that we utilize radio equipment. We need to bear in mind safety. So first of all, we will be using our radio, and we will advise that to avoid touching the antenna. There's something called RF burns that we can receive. So that's the first part of our safety moment. Be careful when you are touching an antenna connected to a radio. Also avoid short circuiting if you have a power supply or a battery. So the poles should not touch each other. You should not use a conductor to connect both poles directly of a battery or even a power supply or anything like that. You can short circuit, and that inrush current can in fact lead to an explosion, for example, if it's a battery. So safety operation with batteries, and of course for emergency purposes, as reactors, as radio operators, we tend to use batteries, and we need to be very careful around them. You know, we shouldn't take them for granted. We should always be safety conscious. Also, lightning. I don't know how many persons saw a recent video that was circulating on social media with a footballer in Peru, I think it was, playing football, and that's it. You know, a lightning strike, cloud to ground strike, and I think he got killed, and of course it knocked out a few people that were nearby, injuring them. So when we're outside, the lightning storms, lightning activity, it doesn't have to be immediately in front of you. Once you're hearing the lightning, once you're seeing it, that's a good indicator that you should have been indoors by then, you know, as it comes on. So we need to monitor for lightning, and lightning doesn't have to occur immediately over our head at the top. Lightning can go laterally, horizontally, and strike us still, or even if we don't get a direct strike, you know, one of the sub-strikes could in fact affect us as well. So that's why you say don't go under a tree. But as radio operators, we do not want to be operating radio equipment in the presence of lightning. Certainly a handheld radio on the outside, a mobile radio also, you have to be very careful there, and certainly a base station radio where the antenna will be connected to a feed line of some sort, coax cable coming into our home, and we are at the other end of that coax cable where the radio is connected. So we just need to be very mindful of those things, right? Not scared, but cautious, mindful, and be wise. Also, another safety point when we are connecting radios to multiple antennas or multiple antennas to multiple radios, sometimes we use a switch box, sometimes, or we are just using coaxial cable to connect the different radios. Just be careful we don't inadvertently connect a radio to a radio directly. As in, when you transmit, you can damage the radio equipment, and you can also cause, let's say, someone on the other end of that cable, if they're touching it, they may receive an RF burn. So some of us, we tend to want to connect up equipment, but when we are doing so, we need to be very mindful and look out for each other. Second to last point on your screen, antennas and power lines, they don't mix. So we should avoid having antennas anywhere close to a power line. There must be enough room away from the power line so that if the antenna were to fall or breeze blow or something like that, it would not come into contact with a power line. Those are usually low, medium, and high voltage power lines that may be in our vicinity, and we need to be mindful of it. So the bullet point says keep antennas away from power lines for that main reason. You can be electrocuted if your pole, your mast with the antenna moves and gets in contact with a power line of any kind, and you are the other end of it. There can be a terrible condition and lead to electrocution or injury. So the last point, again, hearing is important of all our senses. Is one of the key senses that could be damaged. And as radio operators, we need to be responsible and ensure that our volumes are not at exceedingly high levels. Sometimes we turn our radio on and the volume is all the way up, and maybe it's a handheld and we put it to our ear, and you get a blast from transmission coming in. So the point there is that we want to carefully avoid that. We want to carefully adjust our volume levels so that we don't injure or cause injury or discomfort. And the way you do that is turning on the radio if that's the type of device and you have a volume control. Don't put it all the way at max. Maybe you could start quarter or maybe as much as a half, but always just don't put the radio to your ear directly. That can really cause injury to you. All right. So these are our safety tips. It's a safety moment at the beginning of our session, only to illustrate that safety first in all that we do, whatever we do, especially as reactors. We are involved in response, we involved in emergencies, we involved in assisting with disasters, projects. We ourselves must not become that disaster or part of the disaster or be affected. We're there to assist, right? So we prefer that we keep ourselves safe, and the way to help others is we must be safe. As is always said, with respect to if you're on a plane, they will advise you put on your mask first in case that oxygen mask has to drop. You may have, you may be tempted to try to do it and assist someone in your care, and you'll think, well, it's selfish to put on your own first. Well, no, if you're not around or you're not able to help anybody else, how is that helpful? So that's not being selfish. That is actually making sure that you are available to assist others. So self-safety is important, safety first. So we want everyone to be safe, but we must take care of ourselves so we can take care of others. Right. So let's get a little bit into some surrounding areas. And usually when we deliver communication type, let's say presentations, I tend to like to start with this communications model because, anything that we're doing, what's the purpose of it? Why are we doing it? So we talked about being ready for emergencies, assisting others, communicating, and so on. But there are frameworks, there are models that underpin what we do, and it's usually helpful to have these concepts in the back of our minds so that when we discuss various things, even if everything doesn't connect together immediately, having a frame of reference is helpful to see, this is where this fits into what we're doing. And we're talking about communications. So just quickly on a model that, illustrates really nicely what communications are about, right? So you'll see here a model. You'll see two radios, two walkie-talkies or two handheld radios, one on the left, one on the right. So we'll label one as the sender or the transmitter and the other one the receiver, right? So you have a sender, you have a receiver. And again, this is a generic model, so it doesn't have to be radio only. This applies to any form of communication. It doesn't have all of the components, but has the majority of the ones that matter for most communication. And you will recognize a sender and a receiver. Those are the two entities that need to communicate, whether they are two persons, they are two devices, they are two devices being operated by persons. The point is sender, receiver, and the idea is to get a message across. And at the end, that's what we are doing. We want to do it reliably. And the parameters that we'll discuss in the upcoming slides is all about how can we do so properly, legally, and efficiently and effectively. Those the essential aims that we have, but it's within a framework, and that's the communications model, sender, receiver. So we're trying to get a message across. Now, to get a message across from a sender to receiver, we'll recognize that we need some form of a channel. Now, with respect to our radio communications, we may say the channel is channel 1 or frequency 150 decimal something, or we may say it's a radio channel. However, we wish to describe that channel of communication, whether it's a frequency, a channel number, some means. It could be the internet, it could be smoke signals. It can be any channel that is suitable to get the message across. But the point is, all of those pipelines, if I may use that term, will be considered channels. So between the sender and the receiver, you must have a channel. Now, what we will recognize is when we have a channel, what we aim to do between a sender and receiver is to send a message. And you'll see in some of the slides coming up, we'll be talking about concepts that relate to the channel, the message, how much space the message occupies. So we'll be talking about things like bandwidth and modes and so on. So hopefully all of that will become clearer as we go through a couple of these slides. But we have a channel between the sender and the receiver, and a message goes through or along the channel, and hopefully it does so reliably, and it gets there safe and sound. Sometimes it could be obliterated, or it doesn't reach due to interference and so on, and we come to that. But when we are going to send the message, what occurs at the sender end is called encoding of that message. And that message could be encoded, for example, in speech on English. And then when we speak, that may be analog voice that will go into a digital circuitry and send it over maybe a digital channel on your radio frequency to the receiver. And they will, on that channel radio frequency, they will decode the message that was encoded on one side. So you have the sender who is encoding, when a message is encoded on the sender side, and that message goes through the channel, and it's received by the receiver on the other end, and it's decoded. So that's essentially what we're doing now. It could be, we're talking using language encode and decode, but when we speak, we're encoding in English. It doesn't necessarily have to be encrypted, but we are encoding, right? We are putting it, we're speaking a thought into a voice, and we are also putting it electronically onto a radio frequency carrier wave, and what we call modulate, or we stimulate the carrier wave, that radio frequency wave. It moves up and down or left or right and whatever, and goes through the air and gets to the other side, and that's encoding. And of course we have to decode it. It's going as part of radio frequency. You have the electronic component and the magnetic component of the radio frequency wave. That's why we call it RF, radio frequency. And when it gets here, we decode. So that's the message we're trying to move across the channel. But when it gets to the receiver, of course, hopefully it's understood. And what if it's not understood? Or what if it is understood? We need to provide some sort of feedback to the sender. So that's why on radio, we will say, okay, someone has sent a message to the receiver, and the receiver say, okay, message received. Or citizenman radio operator may say 10-4, or to acknowledge, or someone may say, I acknowledge receipt. Or they may do what is a good thing, which is to repeat the message that was received to make sure it was done so reliably. And that's why a lot of the times, training and react operations, we read back. And when the person hears our readback, we may say, okay, readback is correct, or acknowledge, or you have received the message correctly. So feedback is important. Or the person could say, I did not get all of your message, or send all after some point. Maybe there was a car passing and created a noise, or maybe we weren't using headphones and the ambient noise is pretty high. So feedback is important. And we have been talking about noise. That affects the channel. There can be RF noise, there can be audio noise, there can be all sorts of other noise that causes the signal to deteriorate or attenuate, or it could be the channel itself. introducing noise, and sometimes that's where we need to shift frequency or change channel or use another mode of a backup communications means. So folks, hopefully this communication model would be helpful in terms of some of the concepts we'll be talking about, where it fits into communication. What is all of this about? Well, this is the communication model, and let's see how it goes, right? All right. So welcome to all those who would have joined us since. We really appreciate you being here. Thanks to all of the members and prospectors who have decided to attend. All right. So let's go. Right. So we talked about a communications model, and we talked about using radio equipment. And this webinar speaks to radio standardization. But what are we looking to standardize exactly? Well, there are several things that could be standardized. One of the things would be radio equipment. Of course, those of us who may be quite familiar would already recognize what's on your screen, but some of us may not be, or some of us could do with a refresher. So let's talk about the components of our craft, our equipment, radio equipment. We may say we want to standardize this, but can we really standardize everything? So what can be standardized? Well, we have different brands of equipment, we have different models of equipment, and we have different features that each brand and model will bring. And it may be desirable to standardize on some of these features. It'll be great for each piece of equipment that we use to have a standard ability to power up and power down the equipment, a power button. Volume control, that's another feature that a radio can have that we will utilize. Increase the volume level, reduce it. You don't want it too high, you don't want it too low, too high. It will interrupt someone. Channel selector, well, maybe we have multiple channels, and certainly in React we may have a couple of channels that we can use and switch, whether we and we'll come to simplex and repeater operation. Maybe we want to operate short range, so we'll select simplex. Maybe we want to do wide area, so we'll select repeater. And a channel selector is required, and maybe we want to standardize on the type of channel selector or selectors that we use. And not only that, maybe we want to standardize the order of the channels. Channel 1 means this, channel 2 means that, channel 3 means that. So when you go on any radio, a React radio, channel 1 is always, for example, the console repeater. Channel 2 maybe is always the console frequency in simplex mode, and so on. So there are a number of things we can standardize on. Maybe squelch is a feature we would like to have, either a button or let's say a soft key. Certainly a microphone and a push to talk button, an antenna, and so on, right? So we have quite a few bullet points here about some of the features on a radio that we may wish to standardize. But notice here, this is a particular brand of radio. This is also another particular brand of radio. And in the early days of radio licensing, certainly in Trinidad and Tobago, when you applied for a license, you'd have to say what brand, model radio that you're applying for that license for, right? That's not very practical in today's world, but nonetheless, there are still benefits of standardizing equipment. So for example, programming a radio equipment. If the technical person has to program radio equipment and they have 15 different models or 15 different brands, then they're going to have software and cables to be able to program all those 15 models. So it may be useful to standardize on a couple of models that are affordable, reliable, and can be programmed, rather than every member having a different model on a different brand radio. It becomes challenging for the technical people to be able to program, or the provider, right? So it's just a mention for your awareness as well. And that's one of the reasons why we wish to standardize on the brand model, at least for a period of time, because as it goes, technology is such that a model that's available today may not be available 5 years down the road or 2 years down the road. Some of them are. As a matter of fact, the equipment that we have on the screen here, interestingly, these things have been manufactured for maybe the last 15 years, and they're still around, that same model, right? But that's not necessarily a practical aspect that we can standardize. But it's useful to discuss it when we're talking about standardization of radio equipment. It may be useful to standardize on things that are already standardized. The power supply, 13.8 volts, for example. Maybe we wish to standardize on the type of connector that we use, and that is in fact so. Many radios have already standardized. Motorola, for example, may have a proprietary connector, or a different connector to, let's say, an ICOM radio, or to one of the Chinese branded. right? So we need to be aware that there are various components that can be standardized. And let's talk about radios here. So this is a handheld radio. We tend to call it a walkie-talkie. Sometimes we call it a portable radio. Um, and this handheld radio, you will notice here, very compact in itself. It has an antenna. And of course, we have batteries that can be replaced at the back and slap in and slap out. Again, that's another reason standardization is useful. If most of us have the same radios, let's say my battery dies, I can borrow one from Anwar, for example. I can say, hey, can I borrow your battery? Mine's discharged. I need to, need some help there. So we can, swap and share. If we don't have the same models or similar models, then we may not be able to share or swap batteries around, right? So just highlighting the advantages, and also chargers. All chargers wouldn't charge all batteries, right? And all form factors, right? Some will have different number of pins, 3 pins, 4 pins, and so on. And even across the various brands, a Motorola charger is not likely to charge an ICOM radio and vice versa and so on, and even within the same family. So having standardization is very helpful. Again, this is an aspect for the technical team, but certainly for all of us as members, we need to consider those things and understand the pros and cons, or the advantages and disadvantages of going with non-standard radio equipment where everybody has a different model. It's cool, we can all deal with our own particular preferences or idiosyncrasies. We prefer this and we prefer that. But a word to standardization. Same thing happens with base station radios or mobile radios, where especially on these types of equipment where we have what we call soft keys, the function of the switch or the button P1 and P2 and P3 and P4 on this radio, it's just labeled as P1, P2, P3, P4. What is P1? Well, they are soft keys, and the technical people can program it, or the dealers can program it, P1 to be scan on and off. It could be power out high and low. It could be, they could even program it to switch frequency. They can program it to go between narrowband and wideband. So many things that the buttons can be programmed to do. But the point is, if we program it differently for everyone's radios, and even if we don't pick up our radio for a little while, we may forget, because not all of these radios will have on the LCD panel what P1 and P2. We just need to know. Right? Some radios with larger LCDs will actually have at the bottom what P1 means and P2. But then there's also short press and long press. When you short press a button versus when you hold it down for a longer period of time, two different functions you're engaging there. So hopefully we have said enough about why it may be useful to standardize your radio equipment, right? Even connectors between radio and power supply, you can just, I guess, use a standard, connector at the back of the radio, standard connector at the back of the power supply. But on the amateur radio side, a lot of hams, for example, try to go towards what is called Anderson power pole, which are quick release. So you can jack in and jack out radio equipment very quickly. Sometimes you have thumb screws or banana jacks or screw type terminals, and there are different types, and sometimes when you, especially in an emergency, you want to deploy, and you have your go kit and you are coming and expecting certain connectors there, it's different. So the point is, there needs to be a strategy around standardization, right? Those are some of the challenges that exist. Now, of course, you may say, well, if P1 is programmed as high and low and P2 is programmed as scan on and scan off, how do I remember that? How do I know that when it comes to using the radio? That's why using the radio regularly, that's where nets come in, projects and drills. Great way to understand and memorize. If you don't use your radio for a month or two, maybe it will be a mystery when you turn the radio on. What does P1 do again? It happens, right? So regular use and familiarization with the radio. And why is that important? In an emergency, you may not have much time to think or to read a manual or to ask somebody a question. So the more we are familiar with our radio equipment, what it does, what the various buttons do, the better as we'll perform in an emergency. It will be second nature. We will go with confidence and we wouldn't have to fumble. And potentially, when we fumble, we could potentially delay assistance. And remember, in an emergency, lives may be at stake. So we really want to be okura. We want to be familiar with our equipment. So drills, nets, projects, keeping ourselves active, is one way to make sure, and then we may have more than one piece of equipment. We may have a mobile radio or base radio. We may be fortunate to have a handheld radio as well. And the programming may be different. That's why we speak about, to the extent we can standardize, maybe the first button should always be scan on and scan off. Yeah? So those are considerations for the technical team, the technical people, to determine within teams and of course across the various teams and certainly under the council construct. Yeah. All right. Okay, so a question that is often asked, what type of radio equipment exists, right? So there are several types, but we tend to categorize them as handheld. Sometimes we refer to as walkie-talkies or portables. And then we may say a mobile radio or base radio. Now, oftentimes, the radio, the actual physical radio that you use for mobile operation and base operation may physically be the same radio. The difference really lies in how it's powered and what antenna is used. So in a mobile in a car, you'll put your radio inside of the vehicle and you may have an antenna on the outside. In a building or a house, you may have the radio on the inside, power it perhaps via an adapter or a power supply or even a battery, preferably, of course. And then you have an external antenna, usually maybe you'll have a mast. So the same physical radio, this one here at the bottom, could be installed in a vehicle and it could be installed on a base station, but how it's power supplied. So in a base station, you may use a power supply and that's fine. But for emergency preparedness, we generally suggest that you have the option either of a UPS or preferably a battery that you can charge. It can last maybe several days, if we were to lose power. That's part of being emergency prepared, right? Of course, when we're all starting out, we start with something. Nothing is wrong with a power supply, right? But we should be aiming to have that flexibility to power in the event of a loss of AC power from the line. In Trinidad and Tobago, of course, TNTech, right? We may have an outage, and in a disaster situation, poles may go down, and it may be a while before we get power. So maybe we want to have that flexibility. So that's the difference between mobile and base station. But the handheld equipment, usually it's self-explanatory, handheld, right? The battery is contained within the unit, usually replaceable, and the antenna all-in-one, right? So point to note about the differences between a handheld radio. So sometimes we think a handheld radio, we should have universal coverage across the country. We should be able to hit the repeaters anywhere we are. Well, not quite. So a couple of distinctions between a handheld piece of equipment. While it's very convenient, portable, it's limited because the output power is relatively low compared to the base and mobile radios, which can do more power output. So 4 watts, some radios may do a little more, some may do a little less. And of course, we do have the flexibility on many radios to switch between a low, medium, and high power sometimes. But the maximum power of a handheld is limited because the power supply is very small, it's portable. And then of course, we want to make it compact as well, right? Also the antenna, to note, on a portable or handheld radio, it's not very efficient, right? So this antenna here, oftentimes we call it a rubber ducky antenna because of what it's very flexible and so on. It tends not to be a very efficient antenna, right? So that causes the limitation of handheld. VHF radios, for example, mobile-based radios, you can have output of 25 to 50 watts, right? So folks, remember, this is a presentation for REACT members. So we are kind of focusing on what pertains in Trinidad and Tobago, where we are typically using commercial VHF, right? So bear that in mind, trying to customize this presentation to REACT operations. So the mobile radios, the base radios, can have a higher power output. Not necessarily. There are some mobile-based radios that can only do 5 watts, 15 watts maybe. But they tend to be higher in power, such as 25 to even 50 watts. So that alone should tell us that, okay, if it has a higher power, then maybe it has a greater, what we'll call this thing, range. The signal can reach further or farther, right? So also, in addition to which, you are also connecting to an external antenna, usually on a base station or in a vehicle. And that antenna tend to be a bit bigger, longer, and therefore it will tend to be more efficient than, let's say, a handheld antenna on a handheld radio. So that's where the power comes in, So again, we say range. People always want to say, what's the range of a walkie-talkie or handheld radio? What's the range of a base station or a mobile radio? The answer is it depends. It depends on many factors. At the end of our presentation today, we'll refer to practical radio operating tips. If persons haven't seen that video as yet, it goes into a little bit more detail than we can go and touch on today's session, right? So we'll encourage persons to have a look at that video as well. But range really depends on many things. What frequency you're using, the transmit power of the equipment, as well as where you are located and where the location you're trying to get to, whether it's a repeater or it's another person on simplex. And we'll talk about those concepts shortly. Of course, the antenna may have something called gain, and of course the operating conditions, the atmospheric conditions. So many factors that determine range. So sometimes when you ask the question, what's the range of this radio? The answer is, it depends. So important to our standardization efforts in radio equipment is an understanding of two fundamental concepts of radio operations with, especially in the react sense, we use simplex operations and we use repeater operations. And, you know, some of us who have radios already will know when we switch to channel 1, okay, we are the console and it's a repeater, or maybe teams have their own repeaters and so on, and we are the repeater. And then the second channel afterwards, you know, it's simplex. But, you know, we often ask, the question always comes up, well, what's the difference between simplex and repeater? So persons may know already that simplex operation is short range, that may be known, and repeater operation tends to be longer range. But why is that so? The reason is that simplex operation is using one frequency, right? So if I'm using two persons here, we have two radio operators, maybe they're separated by some distance, and let's use the Queen's Park Savannah. Most persons in TNT are aware of the Queen's Park Savannah, and one person is on one side, maybe the Santa Ana side of it, and another person is, let's say, maybe the side by QRC. And that's fairly short range enough, and we know we can communicate via simplex. We go on a simplex channel, and that is radio to radio. When they transmit, when you key or press the push to talk and the radio transmits, you speak into it, the radio frequency goes through space or goes through the air to the other radio, the antenna, they will pick it up and the person will hear you. But that is relatively short range. That is one frequency that you're using. And when the person wishes to talk back to you, they press their push to talk and they speak into the radio, and the signal all leaves their antenna and it reaches yours directly. You can maybe there's line of sight. If you have good enough eyesight or use a bike, you could see the person on the other end. So that's line of sight communication or short range communication, and we're using one frequency. Repeater operation, on the other hand, actually uses a pair of frequencies, but it uses it in this way. So this person who wishes to transmit, when they press their push to talk and they speak into the microphone, it emanates a radio frequency wave. And we're in repeater mode. So it goes on one frequency to the repeater. Now repeaters tend to be up on a mountain top or a hill or a tall pole or a mast. So it tends to have good, the ability to have good line of sight. And it will receive that transmission from the radio. Now, because the radio, the source or the sender and the destination, so you see where this model is coming in. You have the sender, you have the receiver. They may not be able to go simplex directly to each other because they're so far away, maybe several kilometers away. But there's this repeater on a hill as an intermediary, as a relay. So you transmit on one frequency to the repeater. What the repeater will do, it has the capability of simultaneously, as it receives this transmission on this one frequency, on this frequency, it will retransmit simultaneously and automatically on another frequency. Right? It cannot transmit on the same frequency that it is receiving on, right? So it transmits on another frequency, which is what all the other radios that are listening will hear, the other frequency. So that's why we say in repeater mode, there are two frequencies in use. When you're on channel 1, there are actually two frequencies configured for channel 1. One, when you press the push to talk, it will transmit on, and when you release the push to talk, it will listen on another frequency. So it's the same channel 1, but it is actually listening to two separate, the repeater is operating on two separate frequencies. Your radio is also operating on two separate frequencies. One when you transmit, and when you release, you're listening to another frequency. Again, same channel. So that's why we say in simplex mode, if you're on channel 2, for example, it's one frequency that you're transmitting on, and it's the same frequency that you're listening on. In repeater mode, It's one frequency that you are transmitting on and you are listening on another frequency. So one frequency versus two frequencies. And that's a key difference between repeater operation. Of course, repeater operation tends to be wide area. So I may be in Diego Martin and let's say someone else is in, let's say, Curep, and I am transmitting from Diego Martin, let's say, to a repeater in Cumberland Hill, and that repeater will transmit and persons in Curep will hear that transmission, and vice versa. When they transmit from Curep to the repeater will retransmit or rebroadcast the message, and I will hear that signal in Diego Martin. So that's the power of a repeater, and that's a key difference that we need to be mindful of, and also why we, in standardizing the programming of our radios and the channelization, we should ideally have, channel 1 meaning a particular, it's challenging to do so, channel 1 being a particular frequency and channel 2 being another, and so on. But to the extent that we get standardized, it's helpful, especially when we loan radios and so on. It is helpful. It is often a bit impractical to have perfect standardization of channels, but it's something that we could aim for and try to closely achieve, right? All right, so let's continue. So we did talk about frequencies, we talked about channels, and we also want to introduce the concept of bandwidth, right? So let's talk a bit about that, right? So first of all, we refer to frequency, and frequency will be the actual carrier wave frequency that we are using at any point in time. So a channel may be channel 1, and I may be transmitting on frequency 150.345. That is a frequency, right? And that'll be 150.345 megahertz. That's a frequency, but it's on channel 1. The only persons in the commercial contact that needs to be aware of the actual frequency will be the technical people, but all the rest of us that are just users, we really just need to be aware of what channel 1 is, what channel 2 is, and so on, right? But the technical persons will have to program the frequency for the particular channel. But we need to be aware that in frequencies, there are different frequencies. The frequencies are specified by a number. 150.345 may be the transmit frequency for a repeater, and 159.625 may be the other frequency. Again, it's not too much of our concern at this point as to what an actual frequency is for us to use in the commercial sense, right? But we should be aware that on a channel, we have frequencies programmed onto these channels. Whether it's a simplex channel, it will be one frequency. If it is a repeater channel, it will be two frequencies. So we need to also be aware of modes. So you may hear about the mode that is in use. Now, for most of us, that mode that we will use will be FM mode. But there's a reason we are talking about modes. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's talk about some of the other types of modes that exist. So a mode, for example, will be FM. I mean, it could be AM as well, right? But FM is one of the example modes, and we do use FM quite a lot. FM stands for frequency modulation. You may be familiar with FM when you listen to your radio broadcast on the FM dial, 95.1 megahertz. That is FM, right? Frequency modulation. So that's the reference for FM. So we also do use FM in our scenarios as react radio operators on the VHF spectrum. The mode that we use is FM. But there are other modes. DMR, digital mobile radio, is another mode. It's a digital mode. And P25 is another mode that's digital mode also. So we have two types of modes. We have analog modes and we have digital modes. The point is, when we were talking about encoding and decoding in the model earlier, we can encode using an analog mode and we can encode using a digital mode. But the decode on the other side has to match. That's like saying one person is speaking English and on the other side you have a Spanish speaker. It will not compute, right? That Houston will have a problem. There will be no communication unless you have a translator. So you need to encode and decode in a similar manner. So if you're encoding using an analog mode on the sender side, such as FM. On the other side of the receiver, you also need to use an analog mode of FM. In other words, you cannot be using FM on the sender side and the receiver side is using a digital mode to decode. Unless, of course, it can switch to the analog FM mode. So for our purposes here, we are using FM in React, typically, right? We could use other modes, but we are using FM. So let's come to the point about FM, and this is really what I would like. It's important for the technical folks, but it's useful for us as members to be aware of this. There is a difference in the bandwidth when it comes to any mode. And there is also, with respect to FM, two different, well, there are more than one it could be used, but there are two different bandwidths that we need to be concerned with in the React context. And that is called narrowband and wideband. Now, some of these terms are a little bit confusing, and I've attempted to include the information here as well so that those who may be aware of some more advanced information, it would not be confusing, right? But let's kind of go with the flow for the moment, right? So there are two types of FM modes that we talk about in the React context. And in React, of course, we use commercial equipment. We use commercial VHF equipment as opposed to amateur equipment. And we'll talk about that a little more in a little bit, right? When it comes to type certification. But we use commercial equipment in React, commercial VHF. And as of now, many of our channels of operation in React uses FM wideband or widebanding operation, which is 25 kilohertz, right? So that's like you have a highway and we're occupying two lanes, the spectrum, the radio frequency spectrum. But there's also narrowband where you can have the same information encoded and carried across the voice information, and you can occupy less space on the highway. You can occupy one lane, which is about half, 12.5 kilohertz. So that's the main message here. You can occupy two lanes or one lane. If you're occupying one lane, it's 12.5 kilohertz. If you're occupying two lanes, it's 25 kilohertz, right? This is the frequency bandwidth that is, and we can talk about deviation and so on, but in terms of the bandwidth that you assign, and your license specifies what bandwidth. So remember we talked about compliance and being, in good order. Why we are talking a lot about this is that we need to be conscious of it, especially technical people, but it's useful for all of the rest of us to know that if we have a license that is a narrowband frequency, which is 12.5 kilohertz, we should not and cannot and ought not to program it in wideband mode, which is 25 kilohertz. That will be improper. It will be against the regulations, certainly. Some will use the term illegal, but we need to be aware and conscious of it. Whether the license that we have or the frequency that we're using is in wideband mode or narrowband mode. Again, let's not confuse wideband mode with FM wideband when we talk about other receivers that will receive commercial FM stereo broadcast in wide FM, right? So that's what this note here is about, right? We're not using wide FM in the commercial broadcast sense, right? So we are talking about FM, which is an analog mode of transmission, and we need to be aware that there are two types of FM, narrowband and wideband. Now the React Council frequency license, for example, is wideband, which is 25 kilohertz. Some teams may have simplex frequencies or even repeater frequencies that the license is provisioned as 12.5 kilohertz or narrowband. And this is important. It could be easily overlooked inadvertently, and certainly if we are not aware of this distinction. So this is a key thing for us to be aware of the distinction. If we are not aware of it, we could inadvertently and irresponsibly program the incorrect bandwidth. So this, folks, if we take nothing away from this slide, this is important because this is an error that can occur. Will it work? Yes, it will. But we need to be mindful of, again, we're talking about compliance, right? Radio standardization. And this is a statutory requirement. And I'm spending a fair amount of time here because there's a lot of room for misunderstanding and forgetting and misinterpretation, and sometimes people have their own ideas as well, but what we need to do is check the license. The license will actually specify it, right? And this is really more for the technical people in the team whom I believe already are aware, but just to concretize it, but our general membership should also be aware of this, right? It's good for us. We are all radio operators, and I find it's very useful as a radio operator to be aware of these things. So again, in summary, this slide, FM operation is what we use in React. It's an analog mode, and we are on wideband for the council frequency 25 kilohertz. And some teams may have simplex frequencies and repeaters that they are using 12.5 kilohertz. So the repeaters need to be configured if you're doing narrowband for 12.5 kilohertz, and if it's 25, you need to use 25. The challenge here is that older radio equipment sometimes does not have the narrowband capability. It is not able to do 12.5 kilohertz. Some older equipment can only do 25 kilohertz. Some newer equipment is also not able to do 25 kilohertz, right? Especially if it's for the US market. The hard code in it that the radios there in that market cannot be programmed to wideband. There was a narrowbanding effort in the US that took place. So of course, manufacturers like Motorola, ICOM, and so on in our territory, they know that we can do wideband, and they may in fact specify 25 kilohertz. So folks, we'll decide at the halfway point whether we'll take a couple of minutes break for persons to get up, take a stretch. So we'll probably do that at the top of the hour before we go on to the rest of the session, right? So folks, this is the key point on this bullet point here: difference between narrowband and wideband, right? So we have a couple other bullet points here. So the one that I mentioned earlier here at the bottom, which is if you're talking about broadcast radio, there is the concept of wide FM as opposed to narrow FM in a receive sense, right? So it's not the same when we're talking about 12.5 kilohertz and 25 kilohertz, right? It's a different concept. So don't let this tie you up when you're talking about radio receivers and so on, wide versus non-wide, right? Or narrow FM. Okay. So this is just a reference slide for persons who are a bit more interested in frequencies and so on, right? This will be of strong interest to amateur radio operators, but I thought I'll include this as a good reference point, because sometimes when we talk about frequency and the bands and, where we're just talking about FM broadcast, we talk about FM VHF commercial, and some persons may ask questions about where's the FRS or GMRS radio frequency in the spectrum. So we talked about the radio frequency spectrum. So we have listed a number of amateur radio frequencies here. When you get an amateur radio license, where you can transmit and on and so on. But we are also showing relative to these frequencies, where's FM radio, where's the commercial VHF that React uses. This is where we are in around this space here. And of course, those of us who have those bubble pack radios, the FRS, sometimes called GMRS radios, this is where it's in the UHF spectrum. So we show where HF is, VHF, UHF, and so on, right? So this is just a reference slide. Everyone will get a copy of this. You can utilize this as you see fit. All right. So let's continue a couple more slides. This is another important slide. So I will spend a fair amount of time on this. And after this slide, we'll take our break. And the rest of slides, think a little bit lighter, right? So let's make a fair amount of heavy weather on this slide here, because it's important. And this slide here has the potential to be problematic if we're not aware and if we don't comply with the information that's on this slide, right? It's a bit controversial, but we are taking the perspective of what the radio regulations, the acts as well as license specifications talk about, right? So this is grounded in quite a bit of established documentation, right? But we are simplifying, and we have tried to keep it a few short bullet points to discuss the concept. So we all need to be aware of what is called sometimes equipment type certification. So what that is simply is, when equipment is produced, it is produced for a particular purpose. Some may say it's produced for a particular market. So in radio, just to keep it simple, we often talk about radios that are produced for the amateur radio or ham radio market, and there are radios that are produced for the commercial market. So most of us, or many of us in React, utilize the radios that are in the commercial space, or ought to use that, right? If some of us become licensed amateur radio operators, then we now have access to amateur radio equipment of that class. And it's two different types of equipment. So Because it's very specific, it is often not very interchangeable, and that is where the controversy comes in, right? So sometimes we will say, okay, amateur equipment can be programmed on the commercial frequencies, especially the Chinese market radios. They tend to be, have less of a distinction on sometimes amateur equipment can be modified so to do what you call open up. But the point here is that commercial equipment is commercial equipment and amateur equipment is amateur equipment. We need to be aware of that. So what we should avoid doing is using clearly amateur radio equipment for commercial purposes if we do not have an amateur license. Right? That's the main point on this slide. But let's go through some of the bullet points to understand a little further when we talk about type certification. So we have the FCC symbol here, and FCC is one of the certifying bodies out of the US, and they will type certify equipment as part, whatever, part 95, part 97, part 15, different parts in their regulations and their laws, their legislation, right? They will talk about what the equipment can do when it's type certified and that sort of thing. So the FCC is one, CE is another. There are few certifying bodies around, but the most reliable, the most dependable, just because it's available, accessible to us to examine will be FCC and our local telecommunications authority. They also, I think, depend quite a lot on FCC type certification. When you want to bring equipment in, for example, they will look to see what is it, class stars or type certified for. So the second bullet point talks about ham equipment, amateur radio equipment, like what is on your screen here. One key difference with amateur equipment as opposed to commercial equipment is that it tends to be front panel programmable, meaning that you can punch in a range of frequency, any frequency that you wish at will. So your frequency agile, you can even use a knob here and go up in frequency and go down in frequency. That is not the case with commercial equipment. So anytime you see a radio you can do that with, there's a better than good chance that it's an amateur class transceiver. Once you could front panel program it out of the box, it's probably an amateur transceiver. Again, the Chinese market blurs these distinctions. So that's where it could be problematic. But once you could punch in the frequency, what we call FPP or front panel programmable, it's likely to be an amateur class transceiver. If you have a touch screen that you could touch up and down the frequency, it's likely to be an amateur class transceiver. Another one, I don't think I have any bullet slide here to tell an amateur transceiver, is if you could press a button and shift minus 600 kilohertz down or up, chances are that's an amateur class transceiver. That is not typically the case with commercial transceivers. So just giving ideas, how you can tell the difference. If you look at your radio in your hand and you could do any of these two things that I just mentioned, chances are it's an amateur class transceiver, right? Also, amateur transceivers, again, the Chinese market is a little bit different, but the mainstream market, amateur class transceivers can typically only transmit in the amateur band. So for example, in the case of the 2-meter band, it's only going to transmit in the range 144 to 148, whereas it can receive wideband, it can receive the entire VHF high, which is 136 to 174, right? So notice that this amateur band is a subset of the wider VHF high frequency band, right? So bear in mind that amateur class transceivers have these properties here. So let's talk a bit about the commercial class transceivers. And this is what React members should be utilizing. All of us who are reactors will typically be using commercial class transceivers or type certified for commercial use. It tends to be channelized. What do we mean by that? Channel 1, channel 2, channel 3, maybe up to 16 channels. Some will go as much as 128 channels. Some may have 512 channels, but they tend to be very channelized. It's not to say that amateur class transceivers may not also be channelized, especially the earlier ones. But commercial class transceivers, you tend to have maybe a dial that you can switch between 1 and 8 and 1 and 4, 1 and 16 channels. That's how you know commercial class transceivers. Also, another distinction is commercial class transceivers need to be configured or programmed by a technical officer, for instance, or a dealer. It tends not to be programmable by us as the React member. We tend not to be able, unless we of course duly qualified or capable and so on, right? most of us should not ought to be able to program this easily, right? We need to be trained, we need to be aware to be able to program it. So that's why some of the earlier slides where we talked about narrowband and wideband, we need to be experts at those distinctions to be able to program this. Otherwise, we may inadvertently program it in such a way to cause harmful interference. Again, that is against the law, and it can also create havoc. You can do some damage if you incorrectly program a transceiver. That's why these things are so protected. We know members would like to, could I have this frequency? Could I do this? Could I do my own thing? But we can literally shoot ourselves in the foot if we don't know all of that bit of information. And even technical people, sometimes we have to be so careful. Even though we are aware, we also are very careful as well. So I know members will say, well, I should be able to do what I want. Well, no, the regulations do not say that. And I think we all want to be responsible, right? So hopefully that would be an explanation as to why there are restrictions. It's not that, people say we don't like people, or it's really about making sure this is radio frequency. We started with safety first. We didn't really talk about harmful interference, but interference is one of the things that can happen if we incorrectly program a radio. And that's why amateurs, we tend to have, requirements of an exam, and you go through training, enough information about the regulations and so on, and technical information to hopefully not shoot ourselves in the foot, right? So as commercial radio operators, we just want to learn the radio operating practices, not necessarily, how to program narrowband and wideband, and how to, what's this frequency separation, and all these other technical parameters, squelch level and all that. We don't necessarily want to learn that. If we do, then a good way to go into is either commercial radio qualifications or amateur radio, if we're interested in that technical aspect of it. So hopefully, folks, I said we will spend a fair amount of time on this slide. Hopefully, we are answering the question as to why commercial radio transceivers are programmed by specialists, either technical officers and or dealers, right? So they are programmed by authorized dealers, with the user being unable to change the frequencies. You can change the channel 1, channel 2, channel 3, but as a regular user, I am not able to change the frequency. I have to give that to a technical officer who will duly program it and keep a record of it, or a dealer who will do the same. So we need to be responsible. So folks, hopefully that is convincing, right? Hopefully, right? Again, also to note, again, our local telecoms authority, the framework for amateur radio, permits amateurs to utilize commercial gear. There are exceptions that can, be on a case-by-case basis. Amateurs are usually allowed to repurpose commercial gear. Again, it is allowed in the framework, but it's done on a case-by-case basis, right? You have to apply. But generally, I mean, we expect that there will be approval. So if AHAMs want to know, can I use commercial gear? Yes. The whole purpose of amateur radio is experimentation. But again, there are authorities that need to be respected. There are rules and regulations that need to be respected. And therefore, we need to follow those rules and regulations, right? We need to be compliant. We have those statutory requirements that we must observe. Therefore, the answer is yes. Commercial gear can be repurposed for amateur use. However, the opposite is not true. Typically, or almost always, you cannot use amateur gear for commercial purposes. There are some little nuances and exceptions where the Chinese market are concerned. They produce gear that can be used for both and so on, right? So let's not go with the exception. Let's go with the general rule, which is commercial cannot typically utilize amateur gear. Amateur radio operators can potentially have access to commercial gear to repurpose it, yeah? So folks, I'm hoping that, again, this is a key slide. I know this was one of the things that the council wanted to discuss. I hope, I mean, folks, any slide that we are presenting here this evening could easily take a one-day presentation, right? That's how fast we are going through this. We are summarizing, we are keeping it at a very high level, but hopefully with sufficient detail for us all to understand. I mean, if we need to have follow-up sessions to discuss these key points, further conversation and dialogue, certainly those are great opportunities, right? Feedback is important, right? All of us are learning and all of us need to understand together, what is in our best interest. However, a lot of these things are based on legislation or laws, as we may call them, statutory requirements, regulations, licensing conditions, and so on. And that's where all of these things come from, right? So we've attempted to sort of summarize this information, right? So I did promise we will take a 5-minute break at this point and we'll come back. So please consider taking a stretch, get up, have a bathroom break, maybe have some water, and we'll come back and continue with the webinar. Okay, so welcome back everyone. So let's continue and see if we can complete the next half before the top of the hour, right? All right, so we did mention the importance of equipment type certification and that radios or radio equipment or transceivers are usually type certified for very specific purposes and ought not to be used on a service that they're not certified for. I guess a good analogy is that there may be vehicles that are only suitable for a racetrack, right? Maybe Formula One racing. But we don't expect to see a Formula One race car on our roadways, on our highways, right? It's fit for purpose to race, but may not be suitable for the roads. I don't know if that's a good analogy, but that's the only one that comes to mind at the moment, right? But certainly, we need to be mindful. One of the key challenges we have is that because some, especially the Chinese market, a lot of the amateur class transceivers or transceivers that will be suitable for amateur use are really not suitable for commercial use for the reasons we pointed out earlier, which is that they're front panel programmable, frequency agile, you could just change the frequency at will, program it, and therefore cause a lot of havoc. So we know out there are some companies that are selling these radios, for example, like the Bofengs and so on, and people are just taking it, programming it. Really, that is not supposed to happen. Now, those who don't know, that's fine. But again, it's React, and we'll come to a slide that sums the expectations of React members, right? Reactors are expected to be responsible, and that's why we conduct training so that we inform ourselves. We learn all the time, right? All of us are learning all the time, and I think that's what we yearn for. We yearn for knowledge. We may not be aware of it today, but we are seeking guidance. We're always seeking knowledge, updating ourselves. Things do change over time. And that's where all of us come together, as a learning organization. We keep teaching ourselves, teaching each other, and hopefully we are grounding a lot of our theories and our concepts based on factual information that can be substantiated and documented, as opposed to, we call VAPs, right? Just a thought and, hey, I could do this, do whatever I want. Again, as React as an organization, we expected to be responsible. So we'll come to a slide with some of those expectations a little bit. All right, so hopefully everyone is back. Welcome back. Thank you so much to all of the members who have joined us this evening. Really, really a pleasure to have you in our company this evening on this webinar. Again, organized by the React Trinidad and Tobago Council, and I'm just facilitating on behalf of React International this session today, right? So again, thanks to all. All right. So another, in respect of standardization, we talk about two things. Well, one called the IP rating, and the other one called the factory mutual or FM approval, right? So we won't spend a whole lot of time on this, but this is just in terms of standardization, some ideals that, again, we're talking about radio standardization, and I just thought this will be a useful slide. If you choose to have a look at the webinar that I would recommend up towards the end, which is practical radio operating tips, we go a little more detail into this, so we'll just skirt this over. You may know, sometimes people say that, a watch or phone is waterproof, water resistant. What is it? Dust resistant. And then all of a sudden now we pass by, walk by something and a spray of water gets into the device and that's it, right? So there are specifications that determine whether a device can be used in an environment where it's likely to be exposed to water or moisture, either a glancing blow of water or submerged into water, or submerged, I should say, into water. Same thing with dust, a fairly dusty environment or a very dusty environment. And that is called the IP rating. And we have another slide with a list of it. I said I wouldn't spend a lot of time on this, just for your awareness. IP rating. So you may see radios, you may see phones, you may see any type of equipment that you may be using that will be electronics, an IP rating. And to interpret it, the slide that comes after gives you an idea how to interpret it. But we have some examples here. IP55, limited dust ingress, meaning it will allow some amount of dust protection. Ingress means going in, right? It will allow it from, prevent it from coming in, a limited amount. It will also protect it from low pressure water jets. Notice it didn't say submerged, right? Or immersion. Then we have IP67 rating. Total dust ingress, meaning that any amount of dust, fine, no problem, it will not get into the device. It means we're very well sealed from that. And also, it will allow you to immerse it in water. In other words, it could fall into a bathtub between 15 centimeters and 1 meter in depth. So it can take that. But if you drop it in the sea, a couple of meters deep, right? So all of these ratings are very specific, what you can tolerate. Not that you want to go and get your radio and smartphone or whatever into these environments, but just it's good to know that it's protected, and the IP rating is what you look at. I have a little note here about Ziploc bags. If you're going, I remember React would sometimes have this cross-harbor swim, sometimes I think we call it, or in Maracas. You can put your radio in a Ziploc bag, seal it up. Matter of fact, some of these commercial gear for radios and smartphones are in fact just fancy Ziploc bags, but you can use a good quality Ziploc bag and use it. People worry about, their voice will not be heard. Well, voice typically will travel through the plastic in a Ziploc bag, right? Once it's not super thick, it will be heard. You will be heard, right? So, folks, that's just a suggestion there. And the last point, FM, factory mutual approval. That simply means if you have FM with a little diamond or FM approved, typically that will mean that the radio is intrinsically safe, meaning that it is suitable for use in areas where a spark could cause an explosion. So a very dusty green environment, or where you have some sort of maybe methanol or any of those types of flammable type gases, the FM rating will say that you can reasonably use that equipment there. If it's not, and you press the push to talk, for example, or you have the battery and it can cause a spark. So you need to be mindful of that. Again, though that type of equipment tends to be more expensive. The batteries tend to be quite a bit more expensive, but we're talking about radio standardization. And if you're operating in any of those, let's say, industrial type environments, or it could also be a commercial, even home environment where they can have that risk, right? You need to be aware of it. That is likely to be, as people become more safety conscious and they begin to pay more attention. There may be a time where, they may say, okay, only reactors with FM approved or intrinsically safe radios can come into a particular environment, right? So this is, just a skirting slide that we, glossing over just for your information in respect of radio standardization. And this is the table I promised you that will talk a bit about the IP rating. So you can have a look at this, what it means when you have the IP followed by 2 digits. What's the digits mean, right? So IP 67, that's how you get it. 6 means it's dust type and 7 mean immersion up to. If your radio is IP 32, well, your reader is IP 3, okay, this is what it will allow, and 2, this is what it will allow. So just quickly for your reference, everyone, these slides will be circulated and you have access to it, right? You can read on your own time. Right. Again, just some technical information that is useful to be aware of. I wouldn't spend a lot of time on this slide. We just need to know that our equipment, just like blenders, for example, just like power washers and any piece of equipment that we utilize, there's something called a duty cycle. So people want to know sometimes, let's say you're doing a little punch stall, you have a little business, and you go and you buy a home osterizer or magic bullet, and you find it lasts you 2 weeks, and you'll say, well, this thing is no good. It didn't work for too long. It spoiled, as sometimes we will say, right, easily. What it meant is that we bought equipment that was not purposed for commercial use. So we are making punch whole day, 6, 7, 8 hours whole day. We're running this blender, osterizer, or magic bullet, or whatever it is. And then it goes kaput. It goes poof, right? Stops working, burn out the motor, whatever it is. Same thing with power washers, people want to do a power wash business and they'll buy a domestic class machine, right? It of course it will be a little bit more inexpensive, right? That's, you want to go with something that is less costly, sure, but there's a consequence. The duty cycle it's not meant to be on for all of that amount of time. The blender, you need to purchase a commercial blender that could take the 8 and 6 hours. So for example, in Subway, you have these ovens, they're baking bread whole day or heating up things all day. Those are commercial or industrial class ovens. If we were to take our home oven and try to do that, it won't last long, right? And it's not to say they are bad or they are not very good pieces of equipment, just like TV screens that people want to buy a domestic TV screen and put it up for digital signage and find it burns in a little while. Each thing has its purpose, right? So there is the home or domestic type of equipment, and then there's the commercial and then industrial and so on, right? And of course, it tends to go with cost. What does that have to do with us? Well, radio equipment also tends to have a duty cycle, meaning that you could transmit for a period, but you need to give it a little rest so that it'll cool. Some equipment may have fans that will allow it to force cool. Some radio operators may put a fan on it to cool the radio, especially if you're talking for long periods. That's why also if your radio has the ability to go between low, medium, and high power, apart from utilizing the least amount of power to get the signal or get your transmission across, it can also help with your duty cycle, because when you run less power, then you could probably run the radio for longer. So it's just be useful for us to be aware that our equipment is probably not meant to be on 24/7 to be heat up all the time. Even repeaters, quite frankly, Not all of them are designed. The battle axe type ones, yes, have 100% duty cycle. It could be on 24/7 and so on. But not all repeaters even are designed to be 100% duty cycle, and we may operate them like that. Same thing with handheld radios. A handheld radio, so some people say, should I do a network with using a handheld radio? Well, if you can reach a repeater with a good enough signal, certainly you can. But I don't know if you want to be transmitting for 2 hours continuously as a net control operator on a handheld radio. I don't even know if the battery will last that long, right? So everything for its purpose, right? The duty cycle, the radio will get very hot as well. It was not meant to be continuously transmitting. And hopefully the example of the blender or the cake mixer or the oven or whatever else I gave earlier, will bring, so kind of cause us to understand that in the radio world as well, duty cycle matters, because sometimes we have an expectation that we should be able to transmit all day long on a radio, and that is not actually reasonable. All right. So folks, you can start in the chat if you wish to pose any questions that you may have, and we will seek towards the end to see if we can catch a couple of these questions. And if we are not able to answer them, then what I'll commit to doing is trying to get the answer and submitting it out to the council so that they can submit it to the members. All right. So duty cycle is important. All right, so another form of standardization, radio standardization, has to do with our operational side. Call signs. As we know, we need to utilize call signs when we are transmitting, when we are communicating. And in Trinidad and Tobago, through the coordination of the REACT Trinidad and Tobago Council, call signs are coordinated. And on the right-hand side here, you will see the prefixes of the call signs. We will come back to that in a little bit, right? So we all need to use call signs. That is what, so I don't come on the radio and say, this is Robby, right? I may give my name, nothing is wrong with that, but I have to use my call sign, React 104. And I need to use my entire call sign. Avoid abbreviating as 104, just React 104, that's my call sign. Maybe due to expedience, sometimes, we may truncate, but the proper practice is to utilize our full call sign. React 104 is my call sign. And we need to identify ourselves. It's not appropriate to key and transmit and just send a message like that, right? So if anyone wondered, could I do that? No, you need to. We all need to identify ourselves when we are transmitting. There's no blind transmission or unidentified transmission. That is improper practice. So if anyone is doing that, thinking we can do it, well, you've just heard that is not proper REACT operations. In the amateur radio world, amateurs ought to know that as well. You have to identify, and there's a period within which you have to repeat your identification, right? You cannot somehow come up anonymously and make a comment, So, call signs are usually assigned somewhere. So for amateur radio operators, the authorities will assign it. In the case of REACT, the REACT teams will assign call signs. When we use the call signs, they're usually in accordance with some regulation or some framework or policy, right? In the case of REACT, it will be on the right-hand side, you'll see what is agreed to. We'll come back to that in a bit. So again, in REACT, we utilize VHF radio as our mainstay in Trinidad and Tobago. We may also use things like Zello and voice over IP and other forms of communication. When we do those things, best practice is to use our REACT call signs. If we are amateur radio operators, we are required to use our amateur radio call sign. We can use tactical call signs as well to supplement our amateur call sign. So I could say this is 9Y4R Romeo, also known as REACT 104. But my ident is 9Y4R Romeo. I'm just saying I am REACT 104. The same way I could say my name is Robby, right? My REACT call sign is 104. There's nothing wrong with saying it. But we should not, let's say, replace our official call sign with something else. So on amateur radio, I should not identify myself as REACT 104 only. I can say it as a tactical call. I can say it after this is my REACT call, but I must identify as an amateur radio operator with my 9Y4R Romeo or 9Y4R call sign. All right. So We did mention that the word react in the React context forms part of the call sign. So, for example, we have Arnold's call here, React 100, not just 100, right? Again, um, from time to time it may slip, or we may, say, hey, 100, so and so, right? But when we're identifying and using our call signs, please, it's React 104 or React 100, not just 104 or 100. If we do that at all, it must be a passant, it's just, something by the way. But once we identify our call sign, our whole call sign is that. So let's talk a bit about this table here. I think we're doing okay in time still, so let's spend a moment on this table. So in Trinidad and Tobago, we have 10 React teams, and I believe these, hopefully we have it correctly here, the team numbers, 2496, 4928, and so on. And it's important to note that each team will have members with call signs. Their prefixes, however, have been agreed to in a coordinated way by the React Trinidad and Tobago Council, and this has been so for many years. And that's, by the way, one of the functions of a council, to do that, those types of coordinations where teams could agree on to be bound by a particular policy, and this is one. So 2496, once you have, you hear React call sign, React 1 something something, that's a member of team 2496, right? And so on. 4928 will be React 2 something something, right? So these are the call sign prefixes, and it usually will be digits afterwards, right? So in the sequence of things, we are using a kind of, I guess if it's numbers, it's hexadecimal, right? After 9 comes A. So team 6278, their membership will be React Alpha or A01, Alpha 01, Alpha 02, Alpha 03, and so on, right? So if there's any mystery, hopefully this would have demystified when you hear React call sign. How did we come up with these things? And actually for several of the, okay, I see that I may have an error here, folks, right? So what I'll do, I did make a little bit of a faux pas here, but I will seek to correct. But the main point about this slide is that there are prefixes for each of the teams, right? So I will correct the typos that I've made here, right? So my apologies, my humble apologies, right? I've just seen it here. All right, so I will correct it so that by the time the slides go out, we'll have the correct prefixes for all of the teams, right? All right, yeah. Okay, so just another, in terms of standardization, I think it's useful. So this is not a course on message handling. Again, we encourage persons to have a look at towards the end, we'll present a couple links to some other courses, other webinars that we encourage everyone to take. We are not really duplicating from that other session, but this is one of the slides that you will find there. We talk about it a little more, and that's message handling. It's useful to have a standardized format when we are doing message handling. And React International has something called the radiogram, but the incident command system, ICS, also has ICS 213, which is a standard messaging format. So we encourage persons to consider standardizing on our React operations. And this is an example of doing so in the radio context, that when we are receiving messages and passing it, we utilize a standard form. So again, just another idea. All right. So folks, we are looking to wrap up some of these slides. And if there are any questions, again, persons on Zoom, you can utilize the chat feature and you can type in any questions or comments if you have any. And we will seek, if there are any towards the end, we will seek to address any of your questions, right? So just utilize the chat feature. That's at the bottom of your Zoom, right? Okay. All right. Yeah. Okay. So I'm hoping the chat feature is in fact available to everyone, right? If not, I do humbly apologize, right? But nonetheless, let's barrel away and complete these couple of slides, and we'll give a few minutes for any Q&A if we have any, right? Alternatively, folks, if you are not able to use the chat feature and you would like to send a question via WhatsApp, my WhatsApp number is 682-2212. Right, so again, 682-2212. I will try to monitor the WhatsApp in the event that you are not able to send any messages via Zoom, right? So if you're on WhatsApp, feel free to send. Okay, and I'm seeing a couple messages there from persons. Oh, okay, so I see Ron is pointing about the, yeah, so I did see that there, Ron. My apologies, right? Typos. All right, so good. Yeah, okay, right. So I'm seeing here. So folks, I do apologize for the chat being unavailable this evening in Zoom, right? But feel free to send any questions in via WhatsApp. Again, my number 682-2212 or 682-2212. If you have any burning questions or comments that you would like to see and have answered as part of this webinar, please send in via WhatsApp. All right, so let's continue with a couple of slides so that we could achieve the time frame, right? I think we did said maximum of 2 hours. So I think we are okay on time for now, and we're actually coming to the end of the slide, right? So just a few more slides. So this one here, I think the feedback I got, in terms of, well, we do have several well-established React members, I'm sure, in attendance. And we also have some fairly relatively new React members, and we also, I believe, have some new or prospective members that are joining. And this is a slide on some of the expectations as React members that we strive for. All of us are expected to be held to a high standard. Again, we are human beings. We're all part of society. However, as React, the brand React, the name React, we need to live up to these expectations. We should all strive for these, what we have on this slide here. And I'll go through a little bit, talk through them a little bit. Whether we are there yet, these should be things that we every single one of us should be striving for as a member of React. When we go out there, especially and assist with served agencies or our served organizations or our partners, or when we respond to emergencies and disasters, whatever we are doing, we must represent React. And some of these bullet points here speak to the tenets of what we should be representing, right? We need to be trained radio operators. That's, I guess, why we're also doing today's session. That's why we follow React forms a large part of what we do. And I congratulate the council and all of the teams for the really good work that's being engaged with respect to training. I mean, today's session, I think, is testimony to the work of the council in particular on training. Being very serious about training and development. And that is one of the key expectations, that we are all trained radio operators. Are we all perfect radio operators? I don't know that, but we should strive for excellence as far as practicable, right? We should always be, all of us, myself including, are always learning, right? We're always improving, and that's an expectation, being trained. We have to be ready for emergency. So we talked a bit about, when we were looking at our station and our equipment, we can have power supplies that are using AC or line power. You plug it into a wall outlet and you convert it to 13.8 volts DC that powers your radio, for example. But if we were to lose line power, TNTech, for example, power, we need to be able to have backup power. I mean, a handheld radio with a battery will work, right? But if we're on a base station, we may need to strive for having, let's say, a battery. Some persons may be able to go all the way and having solar-powered, solar charge with a charge controller, MPPT charger, charge controller that can charge their batteries as well through alternative energy, wind power or solar. All of those things are great to the extent that we're able to, right? But you can have a basic charger that can charge a standard battery, gel battery if you can, or even a lithium iron phosphate battery or LiPo battery. even better, lighter, and so on. The idea is to be resilient, to be ready for emergencies, which is what the second bullet point is about. Another one too, we need to be efficient and effective, right? So our communication, we cannot take long to communicate, when our served agencies expect us to communicate the message rapidly. That's why you'll want to know why are so many, they want our help in a walkathon or a sports day, or we have concert or carnival, whatever. Whenever people ask for assistance, they know we can get the message quickly. And one of the projects I always recall would be the Soca Monarch project in the stadium. I mean, when cell phones don't work, our radio systems do. And we can get our message across. Sometimes it saves lives, there are incidents that occur in such an event, and they have no way of using cell phones. It's congested, right? And our radio operations have saved the day because we're able to be efficient and effective. So that's another tenet, that's an expectation. Well, the whole purpose of today's snippet, couple, ideas and thoughts is about standardization. And we talked about several parameters that we as reactors teams, the council, should be aiming to standardize, or we have already standardized. And I'm sure, especially the council and the technical officers, the technical committee, will be looking to do further standardization, is my understanding. And I applaud all of the efforts of the council and the teams and the membership in doing so. To the extent that we are standardized, the better. We need to standardize with flexibility as well, if I might add, right? So it's not about rigidity, it's about being appropriate. And again, one of the key elements in standardization is making sure that we're compliant with the established standards, compliant with our license in particular. So again, I know sometimes, colloquially we think, hey, I could do anything I want, right? Not really, folks. Some of the things doing what we want may be in breach of regulation, right? So again, if we're individuals, maybe we can choose to do that. But as React, no, sir. We are required to be compliant. That's one of the tenets as well. React, we aim to be a well-disciplined organization, right? That doesn't mean we have to be straitjacketed and we cannot have a little bit of fun and, enjoyment. It's important we enjoy what we do, but we need to be disciplined. We need to be professional. That's what we should aim for. So, there's a time and place for everything. When we linemen, okay, we're making jokes and fun, but when we are on the field, when we are engaged, we need to be very sober, we need to be very coherent, and we need to be professional. That goes without saying, or I should say it ought to go without saying. But if we are not there yet, that's where we need to be. Any of us are thinking, in other words, if we think we could go on a project and, drink alcohol and say what we want and pass collect, React is not where that occurs, right? So we may need to find elsewhere, right? So not to scare anyone away, but, we need to be serious. And hopefully I'm conveying in a friendly way that we need to be serious, right? Right. Folks, we can have fun, eh? Lots of fun. I'll tell you, this thing, you can have lots of fun, a lot of enjoyment. And you know what? More than that, satisfaction. When you help someone, you save someone's lives. And I mean, every year we hear of so many instances where the React contribution has saved lives. And that, I think, is the enjoyment. That is the fun. That is like, boy, satisfaction comes with that. And that's why we need to be disciplined, and people count on us knowing that. I mean, React finds itself in some key areas that are very highly restricted, right? Where vetted people only go and so on. So being a React member is considered that you're being vetted. I'm spending a lot of time on this. I think the council did ask me to spend some time on this area as well. For persons who may not be aware, now coming in and thinking, well, okay, I can do this, I could do whatever I want in React. Not quite. We could do many things, right? But we need to be serious. That's why we titled this slide, Expectations of Reactors. So I hope I've done some justice to what the council requested on this slide. But again, let's go through a couple of the other bullet points. Of course, we talked about professionalism. Of course, we need to be respectable, we need to be respectful, we need to conduct ourselves in a way, and we need to observe the laws. Observe, not just look on, but actually ensure that we are in accordance and compliant with the laws, right? We are not lawbreakers, right? We could contribute to changing the law if we wish, and that's what React does as well. I mean, React in the context of the things like amateur radio frameworks has responded, the council has responded to, attempt to influence the regulations. Not all of it may be appropriate as time goes on, and we could seek to change those. But while they are what they are, we need to comply. Trustworthy and confidential. Let's talk about confidentiality. Sometimes as React members, we may be in a project where there's medical information, information that needs to be data privacy and data protection, which will become a lot more important as time goes on. But as reactors, as radio operators, we ought to know from a long time now that some of this information is confidential, right? For the served agencies. Um, Dependable and reliable goes without saying, I think. Striving for excellence. Again, we could aim for perfection, that's great, but excellence is where we want to be at, right? It's challenging to be perfect. Some people like the idea of perfection, that's great. Let's aim for it if we can, but where we want to be is excellence, always striving to be better today than yesterday, and tomorrow better, and keep striving for that excellence. I don't know you ever achieve excellence. I think if you ever feel you achieve, I think, that might be resting on laurels, right? We should always be looking for ways to improve, and that's not to beat up ourselves or to be dissatisfied. That is, okay, we have reached a level, and then we need to go to the next level, and that is striving for excellence. Yes, we need to recognize the excellence as well. We have reached a platform, and we need to go further, and never being satisfied with where we are in a way, but also recognizing the achievements that we achieve, striving for excellence. And last but not least, what we are doing here today, continuous learning, sharing best practices. All of us, every one of us have knowledge to share. And that's one of the things about React. We share information, whether it's on nets, whether it's on projects, whether it's on things like webinars. When we get together and we talk about it, we're sharing our experiences. And collectively, that's what React is about. Good. So folks, there are some links that all right. So again, my mobile number is 682-2212, and I'll seek to address any of the questions. I see a few have come in as well already. So great. Thanks for the couple of questions, right? Yeah, excellent. Okay. Nice. So folks, these are a couple of links that I will recommend to all participants, all reactors, to have a consider looking at. So the first one is the practical radio operating tips that was facilitated, requested initially by Team 6006 a couple of years ago, but we did it for all reactors. I think it's useful information inside of this. A couple of the slides presented today are from that session, but we did not go maybe as in depth as we did in the session that there's this link, practical radio operating tips. We highly recommend that you look at this, especially new reactors or prospective members, and even those of us who have been around for some time. I think it's useful for us to take a look at this this video, right? It's available, highly recommended. Also, I think we have a couple persons on the webinar that are not React members. You're welcome, by the way, to consider joining React as well. Also to consume the information as you see fit, right? So all of this is open information available to all. There are React courses that are available for React members to take. And I understand there's a new training committee at React International, and they're looking to republish the training catalog. So look forward to that coming soon. We know many members have already taken the React courses, so highly recommended. Also the FEMA ICS courses, highly recommended as well by React International. There's the link here that you can sign up and also get a certificate. Both the React courses and FEMA courses come with a certificate once you take the exams. And here is, there are two links to amateur radio classes. So persons who would like to become amateur radio certified or become qualified as an amateur radio operator, get licensed, call signs. These are the links to the full courses, both levels 1 and 2. Level 1 is the technician and level 2 is the general class. Also, we have the full set of PDF, all of the slides. When you go to the course itself, you'll see the link to download all of the slides. All of the information is available. Let me see before, we have a couple more slides, but before that, let me start to look at some of the questions coming in. All right, so folks, if you send in any questions via voice note, I regret I will not be able to listen to the voice note. So please send it as a as a text message in WhatsApp, right? I do regret not being able to do the voice note. Okay, right. So Rohan, yes, I will correct the slide with respect to the typos. Okay, right. Right. So Kelson, thanks for your comment there on the chat not being available. Appreciate it. All right, God. Okay, so God asks, what's the advantages wideband versus narrowband? Aha! Okay, that's an excellent question. So I'll attempt to give an opinion on that, right? So fidelity is one of the differences with respect to analog, right? Because you're using less bandwidth for analog, the audio sounds a little more Mickey Mouse. Let's put it that way, right? You tend to be more high pitched, and you tend to the more bassy sounds tend to be well clipped, right? So because you have a higher bandwidth for the wideband, you tend to get more greater fidelity. There's also a challenge if you mismatch. Now, you can have one radio program that's wideband and one as narrowband, and they will be able to talk to each other. But that also further changes the quality of the audio. So audio quality certainly is one difference, advantage or disadvantage. So if you have a chance or choice, using a wider band usually aids in improved fidelity. But remember, for radio, we're not talking music here. This is just voice and communicating. So narrowband is actually quite effective. It's not as though you're giving up a whole lot going to narrowband in that sense. It's not music that you're transmitting, right? So we're still talking about analog here, but digital modes also do very well with narrowband also, right? Matter of fact, in digital modes, you can actually have, in the case of DMR, two simultaneous conversations on the same frequency, believe it or not, because of something called TDMA, time division multiple access, where you have time slots and you can intersperse two signals on the same frequency. Yeah, right. That's amazing. And even narrower type transmissions that could even do 6.25. Of course, sometimes people sound very robotic, especially in digital modes. They sound like, well, robotic is probably the best way. Sometimes it becomes harder to tell the difference between two people because they tend to sound a little more alike with the digital mode on narrowband. An advantage also would be the cost for licensing, right? So at least in Trinidad and Tobago, you pay for the bandwidth. So if you're having a license that's using 25 kilohertz frequencies, and if you have two 25 kilohertz frequencies, transmit and receive in the case of a repeater, you're paying more for that spectrum license, right? So an advantage of narrowband will be a lower annual cost, let's say by TAC, for a license, right? And a lot of new licenses today are in fact narrowband, right? So wideband are in a way grandfathered. If you apply for a frequency now, even radio equipment now will try to move you into the narrowband, and again you will save money that way. So that's another advantage, right? Again, also advantages, well, disadvantages, in the sense that if you have radio equipment that is narrowband capable only, then if you're paying for a wideband frequency, then you're overpaying for something that you're not using as well, right? You should be using the license. What the license specifies also what you should be using. It should be matched because that's what you got a license for, right? I think those are the off the top of my head in terms of the question got asked as far as advantages, one versus the other. But in today's contemporary world, narrowband is the way to go, as it were, right? Excellent question there, Gart. Hopefully I would have answered at least a bit of the question there, right? So let's go, and thank you very much for that question. So let's see, okay, other questions here. Right, are any of them in, okay, right. All right, thanks a lot there, Carlton, for answering some questions in terms of I'm seeing some questions to get into the session. All right, great. All right, right, so a general question is, are there documented guidelines of the council? Yes, so there are several guidelines established So they ought to be available through the council. Um, I know I'd put up on a little site, ttreact.com. Just take a look at that site and you will see some of those guidelines. For example, you will see React's emergency communications plan, which speaks to um, the use of the channels, especially in the emergency scenario. So that's a good start. Persons like quite a few people contributed to the creation of that document, and there can be improvements made as we go along as well. So excellent question. So I would say take a look at the ttreact.com portal. That's something I maintain. Some of them are there. Just look around, click around the site, and you'll get to the documents or documentation link. Right, that should be helpful. And use casual, yeah. So quite a bit of information is on that site. Now, if it is that there are some concerns, there are voids, what I would suggest to members, all of us have the ability to make a suggestion through our team to the council for further standardization, right? Remember, we are React, each and every one of us. And therefore, if there's something, a void, an idea to put forward to improve, I highly recommend making the suggestions. In fact, a lot of the codes have all of the things that have been produced over time have come from the membership committees that have worked on all of these procedures. So there are quite a few existing, and if there are any concerns or voids, feel free to bring it up. But so thanks a lot. Let me see if I have this person's name. Oh, that's Ryan. Okay, Ryan. So yes, take a look at the ttreact.com website, and you'll see a number of those documents available to you there. If not, again, approach through your team and through the council for the relevant documents, right? But you should find quite a few of them on that site, all right? We also have, for example, CB radio guidelines as well. That's on the site, yeah. Excellent question there, Ryan. Thank you very much for that. Okay. All right. Okay, so Ron, it's a comment. Well, I could read out, but let me read it out now. I certainly appreciate it. So I'll read out. So this is from the president of the React Trinidad and Tobago Council, also the president of Team 6005. I'll just read out the comment. I appreciate it. It says, on behalf of the membership of React in Trinidad and Tobago and the RTTC, I wish to express our gratitude and appreciation to you for your very informative presentation. This is another great effort by you. Thanks very much. So Rohan, I do appreciate the kind words. It is a good encouragement, you know, for us to continue on in this regard. I see a similar comment coming from Ronald. So I will just read this one. So folks, I do appreciate the acknowledgements. I'll just read one more. But again, in the interest of time, I probably won't read any of the others, and that doesn't mean no disrespect intended. I do appreciate it. Folks, you know, a kind word really goes a long way in terms of spurring on encouragement and so on, right? So I'm grateful. So I'll just read out one more. Great presentation, Robby, on the issue of using call signs. A reactor should be proud to use their full call sign on any mode, even when using digital communications. Full call sign, prefix, and suffix should be used to avoid confusion with other users and to maintain professionalism. Never assume on digital modes that anything goes. Excellent indeed comment there, Ronald, and certainly appreciate the acknowledgement. Goes a long way. So very good acknowledgement and comment there. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, indeed, Ryan, certainly, I know you can contribute a lot of ideas as well. And this is what it's about, you know, people talk about the they and the them and management. At the end of the day, we all reactor and we're all contributing one way or the other. And it's, once we have an idea, it's to, you know, present the idea. Sometimes we may have to advocate for the idea strongly. You know, sometimes not everyone is on board with the idea. Like even this evening's presentation, I do not take it for granted that everybody simply accepts everything that's in it. And I always advocate to people, you know, we all should be skeptical. We all should be, you know, we should also think, not just take what's, you know, forced down our throat, so to speak. We should ask questions. I also recommend being respectful. I also recommend considering, you know, when facts are presented and taken into account. But if we have concerns, we should articulate them. And that's how we improve. That's how we able as an organization to move forward. So we just have a few more minutes remaining. I am not seeing any more questions as such. So I'll take it as that. Hopefully I haven't missed any. Yeah. So folks, let me just complete with a couple closing slides. Really appreciate your attendance. It's great, especially I see everybody stuck with the session. 2 hours is a long time, but hopefully this has been valuable. Right, so just to promote Zello, folks, there are two channels on Zello. One is the primary channel, React Members with a Space, and React Members without a Space. Those are two channels. I know there are other channels that are promoted as well, but just mentioning these are two well, the first one anyway is a very active channel. Anyone would like to join the React Members channel. There are nets as well that occur, right? So this is just information regarding Zello. Right. So folks, I do maintain a WhatsApp channel, and it seems as though there's some interest in some of the content there. So I've just put up the link there. Should you be interested in joining that channel? Mainly it's information about radio operations, space weather generally, things, seismic information, air quality, if the things of potential interest to React operators, amateur radio operators, and matter of fact, anybody can join it really. We have quite a lot of people there already, so that tells me there's interest. I'm not sure if everyone on the webinar is aware of it. We did share that somewhere along the lines, but feel free, folks, to join this WhatsApp channel if you think the content there is of interest to you. And I'd just like to close by saying thank you very much to the React Trinidad and Tobago Council, in particular, the President, Rohan, and the rest of the team management officers and presidents for the invitation to deliver this training session to the React membership. It's really been a pleasure so to do. I commend the council and the teams and the membership for being interested in training. I like that spirit. That's very well done. Excellent indeed. Keep up that hunger, that interest for information. Keep the sharing. I like what Ryan is saying, talking about making some suggestions. So, the questions everyone asked this evening, it shows an interest, and I find that to be very heartwarming. So I just want to say thanks to everyone. So please be safe, take care, everyone. Again, looking forward to onward sessions, and as we go forward in producing React members that are able to contribute to our community and our society. Training is the key. And with that note, I say good evening, everyone. Good night. Take good care. Be safe. Have a good one.